Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Steps podcast. I'm Lou, and I am delighted to be hosting this podcast. This is a space where we share our experiences and reflections of entering into the Steps process. Steps, if you don't know, is a 12-week journey towards freedom, which is based on the well-known 12-step process, and this one is centered on the Christian faith. We often assume that 12-step programs are only for people with obvious addictions such as drugs and alcohol, but here we reveal how using these 12 steps can bring about profound hope and change at a personal level, no matter what addiction, behavior, or thought pattern is holding us back. Every episode, we share and reflect on the raw and unfiltered personal journeys of three participants, Jamie, Lars, and me, Lou. We share how we began, grew, and are still very much growing in this journey towards inner peace and freedom. In this episode, we are talking about what it looks like to be at step 2, which is we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. So, step 2. Jamie, how did you feel being at step 2?
I have to admit, I liked the word sanity. It really gripped me. And even in preparing for this episode, I went back on some old journals. And when I looked at what I wrote, I could clearly see the insanity of how I'd repeat exactly the same cycle of thoughts and actions and behavior again and again and again. And that none of these patterns of thought and behavior were actually producing any real lasting authentic serenity. So I love the thought that, yeah, you're going to restore me to sanity because there's something insane. And step 2 confronted me with my insanity. And it also invited some options and some choices that at step 2, I could think, okay, I can deal with my over responsibility the way I've always dealt with it. Or I can invite God to show me a new way, another way. So it kind of created anticipation, and expectation, and an openness for something different.
So it sounded like you were quite excited by the prospect.
I was, and I think actually, Lars, I think you set up the excitement when I first did the Steps course, and you said just put aside all your old ways of thinking, your old expectations of what God might say and how this is going to work, and be open to a new way. I liked that anticipation. I found it, exciting that there's going to be something fresh and new.
That's really funny because I felt completely the opposite. I was, I just felt really nervous about it because I was trying to be the good girl and I wanted to do the process well. But I was actually full of doubt, but I felt guilty about the doubt that I felt. So I felt really nervous about entering into step 2. So it's funny that you felt the opposite. It just shows the range of emotions and feelings that people can go in with. Lars, how about you? How did you feel being at step 2?
Well, very different from Jamie, that's for sure. I guess he's the saint amongst us, the saint. So I was at first, I felt a bit insulted by the whole sentence, because I would say, well, I did admit at the time I do have my problems. They are quite big, and the rest of it. But to kind of indicate that it was some sort of insanity going on in my life, I was a bit like, that's not all right. So that was actually my initial response when I bumped into the formulation of the steps. I was deep enough in my sense of powerlessness and need for help to not shy away because of this experience. So I kind of plowed on. And as I did that, I realized that the definition of insanity taken from Einstein, that it's repeating an action expecting a different result, that kind of made the penny drop for me. So I was a bit like, oh, I do see that kind of insanity going on in my life. So And that turned me into a more like what Jamie expressed, a sense of hope and even excitement, because I could see that with my whole way of relating to myself and trying to paint a better picture of myself in terms of how other people would look at me, that had become my fix. So if people in any way showed appreciation, recognition, or even admiration, then that was my fix. But it didn't last very long. And then I was back into trying to fix other people's opinion of me again, so I could have another fix. So I had realized that that was a really, really bad way of living my life. It was a vicious cycle, and I needed help to get out of it. So when I saw that this is really what this sanity, insanity business is about, then I became part of Jamie's club and found the excitement and hope related to the step.
I guess depending on what you're working on, that will impact the perspective that kind of we have going into it. So you were saying, Lars, that you were quite offended by the concept of insanity. And if I'm not mistaken, you were working on pride, which kind of, you can see the two are connected. And I've been working on fear of rejection. And I think deep down, I was worried that if I trusted in a God, what if he rejected me as well? So I came from that mindset. Jamie, remind us what you've been working on.
Well, I was working on over responsibility, and some of it's kind of a offspring, like judgment without mercy. So actually being told you're insane and this is insanity would actually fit the issue as well, because there you go. The reason why it's not working, the reason why you struggle, the reason why you walk on eggshells is because you're insane in this area. So yeah, there was that excitement, there's fresh thoughts coming, but it was also the sense of maybe the phrase just reaffirmed the fact, oh wow, I am ultimately responsible. So that's an interesting thing, that's why you need a power that's greater to break into the thought process, because the steps themselves, if you're not careful, can be a hiding place for the dysfunction, unless a power that's greater, who sees everything, comes inside and says, actually, maybe some of your delight of it, you being called insane, is because you love the thought that you're ultimately responsible, and that if you could just be fixed, you could control the world.
That is just so true. That's definitely been my personal experience too, that it is a risk that you can hide in this process, that you can use it as a way of cover up, also just as a way of saying, well, I am working on myself, so everything is all right. So I can kind of do a surface way of going through the steps without really doing it. So I totally recognize what you say, Jamie, about the need for the higher power as something extraordinary becoming part of this process.
Give us an example what you mean by that, Lars.
Well, so an example would be, and I've heard that actually, I don't think I have a personal example that I can think of now, but I have been sitting, of course, in many groups, and I've had people sitting in groups and starting to express pride in that they were in this process. And as they were talking about that, I realized, well, you do feel a sense of relief that you are able to say to yourself and to others, I am working on my stuff. But as I listened to the reflection, I realized you're not really working on your stuff. You are creating a hiding place, a safe space where you can actually just move on with whatever behavior you have, because you can say, I'm doing something about it without really doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a I can imagine that's a common thing. So if we're in that place, how do we recognize it in ourselves? Because I'm now wondering, oh, have I done that?
Well, I think we probably all have to some degree at some point. That would be very normal, I think. For me, the wake-up call is when I listen to the others in the group, actually, which is also why it's one of the reasons why we need to be with others in this process. Because as I hear others really go deep, really allowing themselves to be confronted with the reality of what it does to themselves and to others, whatever they're working on, and how much it actually damages their lives and they lose out because of it. When I listen to that, that's a wake-up call. And I realize, oh, I need to take this seriously. I have definitely had that experience a number of times sitting in the group where that has been a wake-up call for me. Oh, I actually need to wake up a little bit. I have been too loose in my way of relating to the step this week. So I have definitely had some of that myself.
I definitely found sharing about step 2 in a group setting quite challenging, actually, because I've been to church all my life and I felt like verbalizing some of my doubts was really vulnerable. And I felt almost like I was being kind of like betraying God by saying, actually, I don't feel like he's really helped me with my fear of rejection so far. So how do I know that he's really going to help me this time? And it was a real, like, I had to make it. Well, I say I had to make a decision to just be honest, but probably the first time I worked on steps, I was a bit filtered because I just felt this almost shame about admitting my doubts, especially in a group of other people. So, Jamie, what kind of experiences and emotions did you have as you were working on step 2?
I think the reality was that as a person, I'm really highly self-aware. So my issue, my behavior, its roots weren't in the fact of a lack of understanding or clarity. I looked back at an old journal from 2016, so that's 4 years before I started on a steps course. I'm really clear about over responsibility. I'm really clear about the dysfunctional nature of it. I'm really clear that I'm over responsible because I've got a goal. I want to please someone or placate someone or appease or impress someone, or I'm trying to perform for an accolade. I was really clear of why I walked on eggshells or why I over apologized. But it was like, yeah, I could be clear in my head and clear with really good truths, but it wasn't affecting me on a behavior level. That when I felt pain, when I felt vulnerability, I would just repeat the same cycle of over apologizing, going small, appeasing and pleasing. And it wasn't until I experienced verbalizing those things in the context of community that I began to see a real shift in my outlook and behavior and the way I was seeing things, that as I listened to other people reflect on their own experience, I was receiving illumination, revelation, and fresh insights. I remember the time listening to a lady share about the serenity prayer and her sudden understanding that serenity means accepting the things you can't change. It was a huge wake-up call because I suddenly realized I don't accept the things I can't change. I work on myself. I'm diligent and disciplined. I'm like you were saying, Lou, I try to be good. I try to grit my teeth and do it really, really well. I'm diligent and disciplined, overly functioning to try and change things. I don't accept the things I can't change. That was an amazing thought that came from the outside to me. Just chatting to Lars as a coach, as a mentor in the course, reflecting on my own story, hearing him reflect on his story, gaining insights through getting feedback. So I found the real power of restoration was in the gift of people. And I realized, actually, I was living a lot in my own head. I was trying to sort things in my own thought process. And I wasn't enjoying community in that kind of vulnerable, authentic way. And as I began to do that, I saw huge amounts of shift really begin to happen.
Well, we can have so many interactions day to day where where we just don't really see each other. And those contexts of sharing is where, when we are really vulnerable and saying what's really going on, I really identify with what you said, because I walk away feeling seen, even if no one's commented on what I've said. I've known that people have listened and thanked me for sharing, and I really agree. I found that really powerful. I think when I reflect on my experience in step 2, I think I just still I felt really angry. I identify with what you said, Jamie, about over responsibility. And I think I was so exhausted by life and trying to appease people and do the right thing and be a good girl that I came to step 2. And like I said a bit before, I just felt like, God, I've been trying to get over this for ages. Where have you been? And why should I trust you now? But kind of, I knew that there were more steps to go. So I felt a bit stuck about this, because I was like, oh, I need to get to step 3 at some point. So how am I going to resolve this? And so I had this kind of tension of wanting to be really honest about how I felt, but again, wanting to be the good girl and kind of be ready for step 3, if that makes sense. Lars, what would you say about your experience going through step 2?
So I relate to much of what you guys have been saying, and so I did have a little conflict with my role, so to speak, because I was leading the church where we then did this first course that I was part of. So I had to kind of get over myself sitting in a group and talking about my doubts. That wasn't really in my job description, quite the opposite, actually. So that was an interesting thing. I was really helped, actually, by a guy that I knew from Sweden who was kind of a spiritual director. And he said to me and a group of us, he said, sometimes we really don't want to pray. Sometimes we are really displeased with the whole thing and we can't find faith for anything. And he said, when that happens, the best prayer is to say to God, God, I don't want to pray. That I found really helpful. Basically what he said was, the honest prayer is the best prayer. And I think that's really the spirit of step 2. We become really honest about how are we actually viewing God. Because every person on this planet, whether it's an atheist or whatever, or a stout believer in Christianity, we all have a concept of God in our heads, a way of describing him or whatever, but there's also a heart level concept of God, and it's a heart level sense of God that decides what my relationship is really like. And that's really what is at play for me at step 2, that I start to realize there is a difference between my theory of God and then how I actually relate to him. And that is the beginning of a new journey, which is extremely exciting and very freeing in my experience. And it's also very challenging to have to get to grips with, oh, what I have thought for quite a while is necessarily the truth about how I relate to God.
Totally. I remember the kind of mini breakthrough came on step 2 when I realized I didn't have to pretend I was ready for step 3 and pretend to surrender. And actually what I prayed was, God, help me to want to surrender, and help, like, even in spite of my doubts, help me, rather than putting on this brave face and be like, oh yeah, I trust you, I'm ready to go to step 3. Because I didn't really felt ready. I still felt like I was kind of crawling along with this kind of exterior persona that I was just doing all the right things. And I love what you quoted about kind of the best prayer is the honest prayer. And it does take real bravery to get to that point, doesn't it? I look back and it felt like a really brave choice, but also a really freeing one. Jamie, how did you feel at the end of step 2? How ready were you for step 3?
I think I'd understood for a long time that if I was going to be really free and restored to sanity, I would have to let go of what made me feel safe. So the thought of surrendering over responsibility didn't make me feel good at all. but nervous. Or what would I do with those feelings? One of the things that really helped me was, I think someone said that the goal isn't to have a feeling of surrender, and it's not actually to have an experience of a kind of line in the sand moment where you say, from this moment onwards, I will never be over responsible again. But rather it was, God, would you teach me today what it practically looks like to trust that you know better than me? So I would say, as I left step 2 and went into step 3, I wasn't feeling, wow, I'm ready for surrender. But I remember Lars saying, you can pray, God, make me willing to be willing to surrender. So there was an acknowledgement that I can't, that if I'm honest, I don't really want to. So I'm going to need a power that's greater than me to enable me to surrender. And the interesting thing I began to notice was, without necessarily having a big, dramatic, surrendering moment, I began to see the fruit of surrender springing up. So I would suddenly find a new reaction, or a new confidence, or a new boldness, or a new kind of willingness to be clear and kind in communication and speak the truth. But what's really interesting is that the fruit of surrender and the fruit of freedom didn't make me feel less vulnerable. That when I found myself being clear and kind and speaking the truth and not being silent and shrinking, I would still have this feeling of, oh, I feel so vulnerable. And I so want to jump on the cycle of how I numbed my vulnerability and pain in the past. And in those moments, it would be like, wow, there's the fruit. I've been clear and kind. Here's the fruit. I've not overly apologized. That's amazing. And that's wonderful. That's a real gift. But I still need help, God, because I don't want to get back on that cycle of ruminating and analysis and walking on eggshells. And it's that thing of, oh, there's help available. And surrender just looks like, God, enable me to trust you and take the next step the next day, that when I'm in the next context where I want to shrink back and be overly responsible and do the dysfunctional stuff, that in that moment I can choose to trust you and walk in the freedom of a brand new behavior.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. Lars, how about you? How ready were you for step 3?
It's a good question. And to be honest, I don't really know. What I do know is that my concept of surrendering was under reconstruction, so to speak. Because in my mind, at that time, historically, surrendering was in a way leaning out of my life to something else. In this process, it became something different. It became more about, in a way, leaning into my life, but inviting God into that process. So it was, to me, an extension of what surrendering really is. And I do believe that there are moments where surrendering in a spiritual context is really going from darkness to light, and there are huge life-transforming changes happening with that. And that's amazing when that happens. And there is also this sort of surrendering where it's more in the thousands, small decisions. It's everyday life. It's inviting God into the bits and the bobs of life, and into this very process where I'm doing the long, slow walk, or the long marathon, or however we want to describe it, but where it's definitely not a quick fix, but it's something different, a slow transformation process done by him, but on my invitation. And I think that I was ready for.
Yeah. It is slow, isn't it? And I think coming into step 3, I wanted step 2 to be neatly over. And what I've realized from journeying through the steps is that so often in any given day, I could be back at step 1 and then I'm at step 2 again, and then I'm moving on. And I think for me, looking back, moving to step 3 was almost coming to terms with the fact that it's not black and white. I'm done with that and I'm moving on to the next. And also it kind of, I realized that it's not like I had to have a perfect faith and belief in God to move on. It was just being honest about my doubts and just kind of slowly and steadily moving on, and just holding on to hope that God will meet me there, which he did. But at the time, I didn't know if he was going to do or not. So often the case, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Well, it's been really good to talk about step 2. Lars, what's step 3? We've talked about it a bit, but remind us what it is.
Step 3 is we made a decision to turn our lives and our will over to the care of God.
So the step of surrender. Well, I think we're going to have lots of material for next time. So I'm really looking forward to chatting to you guys about it. Jamie, why don't you say the Serenity Prayer again as we come to a close?
Yeah, absolutely. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, guys.